On February 1st, 1959, a group of experienced hikers set up camp on the eastern slope of a mountain in the northern Ural region of the Soviet Union. Hours later, something caused them to leave their tent in the middle of the night. Not normally, not carefully, but suddenly, and without enough clothing to survive the temperature outside. When rescuers finally reached the campsite weeks later, what they discovered raised questions that still haven't been fully answered, because whatever happened that night seemed to begin inside the tent itself. Expedition was supposed to be routine. The group was made up of 9 experienced hikers, most of them students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They weren't amateurs. Several members had completed difficult winter expeditions before, including routes considered dangerous even by Soviet hiking standards. The journey they planned through the northern Ural Mountains was challenging, but entirely within their capabilities. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student known for being organized and experienced in the outdoors. The route itself was intended to qualify the group for a high-level hiking certification, something respected at the time among Soviet outdoor communities. Before leaving, the atmosphere among the group appeared normal. Photographs recovered later showed them smiling, setting up camp, joking with one another, and continuing through deep snow despite worsening weather conditions. Nothing in the images suggested panic, conflict, or signs that something was wrong, but conditions in the mountains were becoming increasingly difficult. Strong winds reduced visibility, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Progress slowed as the group approached the eastern slope of a mountain known locally as Kolat-Syakhl, often translated as Dead Mountain. At one point, one member of the expedition turned back because of illness. That decision likely saved his life. The remaining 9 continued upward and eventually stopped to set up camp directly on the exposed slope, rather than moving toward the shelter of the nearby forest below. It was an unusual decision, not necessarily dangerous for experienced hikers, but exposed. And sometime after nightfall, something changed, because when search teams later found the campsite, it no longer looked like a place where people had calmly prepared to spend the night. It looked like a place people had tried to escape from. The tent had been cut open from the inside. When the group failed to return on schedule, search teams were eventually sent into the mountains to locate them. Days later, rescuers spotted the tent partially buried beneath the snow on the slope of Kolat-Syakhl. At first glance, the campsite looked abandoned, but the deeper investigators looked, the stranger the scene became. The tent was still standing in part, held down by snow and damaged supports. Inside were personal belongings, boots, heavy winter clothing, cameras, food supplies, and equipment the hikers normally would never have left behind voluntarily in freezing conditions. And then came the detail that changed everything. The fabric of the tent had been cut open from the inside, not torn by wind, not opened through the main entrance, but sliced from within, as though the people inside had needed to get out immediately. Searchers soon discovered footprints leading away from the campsite and down toward the nearby forest. Some prints suggested the group had moved barefoot. Others appeared to show socks or incomplete footwear pressed into the snow. What made this even more unsettling was the temperature. That night, conditions were estimated to be around -25 to -30 degrees Celsius. Survival outside without proper clothing would have been extremely limited. Yet for some reason, the group had still left the tent, and not slowly, not carefully gathering supplies or preparing for evacuation. They appeared to have fled. The footprints stretched for hundreds of meters before gradually disappearing beneath drifting snow. Then, near the edge of the forest, investigators found the first bodies. 2 members of the group were discovered beneath a cedar tree, dressed only in light clothing, despite the freezing conditions. Nearby were signs of a small fire, evidence that at least some of the hikers had tried to survive after leaving the tent. But the fire hadn't lasted long, and as more bodies were discovered over the following weeks, the mystery only became harder to explain. The positions of the bodies made the case even stranger. The first two bodies were found near the cedar tree at the forest's edge. Both showed signs of severe hypothermia. Their hands were damaged, and investigators noted injuries that suggested they may have climbed the tree at some point during the night, possibly attempting to see back toward the campsite, or searching for something in the darkness. But they weren't the only ones discovered. Between the cedar tree and the tent, rescuers later found 3 more bodies scattered across the slope, including Igor Dyatlov himself. What stood out immediately was their positioning. It appeared as though some members of the group had been trying to return to the tent after reaching the forest. Several were found facing uphill, toward the direction they had originally fled from. That detail changed the perception of the entire event, because it suggested the hikers may not have intended to abandon the tent permanently. Something had forced them out, and at least some of them later attempted to go back. But they never made it. 4 weeks, the remaining 4 hikers were still missing. Search teams continued combing through deep snow, freezing winds, and unstable terrain before eventually discovering them in a ravine further inside the forest. And this is where the case became even more difficult to explain. Unlike the earlier bodies, several members of this second group had suffered severe internal injuries, fractured ribs, major chest trauma, a crushed skull in one case. Yet investigators reportedly found little external damage corresponding to the severity of those injuries. Some comparisons later described the force as similar to that of a serious vehicle collision, but there had been no vehicle, no signs of a struggle, no evidence another group had attacked them, and no clear indication of what could have caused such trauma in the middle of a remote mountain at night. Then another unsettling detail emerged. One victim was found missing her tongue over the years. That fact became one of the most discussed elements of the entire case. Some viewed it as evidence of something violent or unexplained. Others argued it could be explained naturally through environmental exposure and decomposition over time. But by then, the case had already moved far beyond a normal survival tragedy, because the more details investigators uncovered, the harder it became to fit everything into one clear explanation. The investigation created more questions than answers. As investigators tried to reconstruct the events of that night, one problem became immediately clear. No single explanation fully matched the evidence. The official Soviet investigation eventually concluded that the hikers had died as the result of what was described only as a compelling natural force. But that wording raised more questions than it answered. What natural force could cause experienced hikers to cut their way out of a tent and run into extreme cold without proper clothing? One of the earliest theories involved an avalanche. At first, it seemed plausible. The group had camped on an exposed slope, and sudden snow movement could explain why they felt the need to escape immediately. But critics of the avalanche theory pointed to several inconsistencies. The tent had not been completely buried. Some footprints remained visible for a considerable distance, and several investigators argued that experienced hikers, like Dyatlov's group, would likely have recognized signs of avalanche danger before setting up camp. Other theories followed. Military testing became one of the most widely discussed possibilities after reports surfaced claiming strange lights had been seen in the sky around the time of the incident. Some speculated that experimental weapons or parachute mines may have caused panic or injuries. Others suggested infrasound, low-frequency vibrations generated by wind patterns, may have triggered intense psychological distress or disorientation. And then there were theories far more extreme. Unknown creatures, secret operations, things hidden by the Soviet government. Over time, the case attracted so many interpretations that separating facts from speculation became increasingly difficult. But despite decades of debate, one reality remained unchanged. None of the explanations managed to account for every detail at once. Some theories explain the injuries, others explain the panic, some address the environment, but no single version fully explained why the group left the tent the way they did, what separated them in the forest, or what happened during the final hours before they died. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why the Dyatlov Pass incident never disappeared, because it wasn't just tragic, it felt incomplete. More than 6 decades later, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the most debated and explained cases ever documented. 9 experienced hikers entered the mountains together, none returned, and despite official investigations, recovered evidence, photographs, and years of analysis, the most important question still has no definitive answer. What caused them to leave the tent that night? Was it a natural event misunderstood under extreme conditions? Or did something happen in those mountains that has never been fully explained? Let me know what you think, because sometimes the most unsettling mysteries aren't the ones with no evidence. They're the ones where the evidence still doesn't seem to fit together.